They say the best revenge is living well. That's a lie sold by therapists to keep us from losing our minds. The real best revenge is sitting at a Michelin-star restaurant on a miserable blind date, only to have your toxic ex walk in and try to publicly humiliate you. It's a nightmare scenario. Unless, of course, the quiet, boring guy sitting across from you happens to quietly run the city. This is how my absolute worst night turned into something completely different. I was 28 and thoroughly convinced that romance was just a socially acceptable Ponzi scheme. You invest your time, your energy, and your sanity only for someone else to walk away with the dividends while you're left bankrupt on a Tuesday night. That was my mindset when I found myself sitting at a corner table in Laura, a restaurant so pretentious it didn't put dollar signs next to the menu prices. I didn't want to be here. My feet hurt. My dress was too tight across the ribs, and my patience was completely shot. But my best friend Jess had worn me down with 3 weeks of relentless guilt-tripping. She promised me this guy was different. He's stable, she had said, waving her hands emphatically. He's quiet. He works in logistics or something. You need a boring man, Nora. You need a guy who owns a lawnmower and reads historical biographies. So I waited. I traced the rim of my water glass, watching the condensation drip onto the heavy linen tablecloth. The restaurant was a hum of low voices, clinking crystal, and the subtle scent of truffles and expensive gin. A chair scraped against the hardwood floor across from me. I looked up. Nora. His voice was a low rumble. It didn't boom, it didn't demand attention, but it carried perfectly over the ambient noise of the dining room. I took him in. Gabriel. He didn't look like a guy who read historical biographies. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that lacked the shiny, obnoxious branding favored by the finance bros I usually dated. The cut of the fabric was immaculate. It sat on his shoulders with a heavy, tailored permanence. His face was sharp, worn in at the edges, with dark hair swept loosely back. He looked tired. Not the tired of a long day at an office, but a deep structural exhaustion. Gabriel, I said, offering a tight, polite smile. You found it. Traffic on the bridge, he said, taking his seat. He didn't apologize, which I actually appreciated. People always over-apologized for things outside their control. He simply stated the fact and moved on. He picked up the menu, his eyes scanning the absurdly priced entrees. Jess told me you work in logistics, I said, trying to jump-start the painful ritual of small talk. Waste management, mostly. Import-export. Moving things from point A to point B. He set the menu down. He hadn't looked at it for more than 3 seconds. She told me you're a graphic designer who hates clients. A genuine laugh punched its way out of my chest. She wasn't supposed to share that part. But yes, I make logos for people who don't know what they want, but know they don't want whatever I just made them. Sounds exhausting, he said. He signaled the waiter with a bare flick of 2 fingers. It wasn't rude, but it was authoritative. A waiter materialized almost instantly. Gabriel ordered a scotch neat. I asked for the driest martini they had. The conversation settled into a surprisingly comfortable rhythm. Gabriel didn't try to impress me. He didn't brag about his car, his portfolio, or his gym routine. He just sat there, remarkably still, listening to me complain about my landlord. There was a heaviness to him, a dense gravity that made the air around our table feel insulated. I was just starting to relax, just beginning to think that maybe Jess hadn't entirely ruined my Friday evening, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. It's a biological response, an evolutionary leftover from when we used to get hunted by predators in the tall grass. I looked toward the entrance. Derek. My stomach plummeted, hitting the floor and rolling under the table. It had been 6 months since I packed my things into garbage bags and walked out of his apartment. 6 months since I blocked his number after finding out he was sleeping with his paralegal. He looked exactly the same. He wore a navy blazer with gold buttons, looking like he was about to step onto a yacht he didn't own. On his arm was a blonde girl who looked barely old enough to rent a car. She was laughing too loudly at something he said. I immediately ducked my head, staring intensely at the breadbasket. "Don't look over here. Don't look over here." "Problem?" Gabriel asked. His voice was flat. He hadn't turned his head, but his eyes were fixed on my face, reading the sudden panic tightening my jaw. "Ex-boyfriend," I muttered, taking a massive gulp of my martini. "Just hoping he doesn't see me." Gabriel took a slow sip of his scotch. He shifted his gaze toward the front of the restaurant, tracking something. Navy blazer. Blonde woman. Loud. "That's him. He sees you." I closed my eyes. Damn it. I heard the heavy, confident footsteps approaching our table. Derek always walked like he was trying to leave dents in the floorboards. "Nora." Wow. What a surprise. I opened my eyes. Derek was standing right next to our table, an infuriating smirk plastered across his face. The blonde girl was hanging off his elbow, looking vaguely bored. "Derek," I said. I kept my voice devoid of emotion. "Hello. Didn't expect to see you at a place like this," he said, his eyes darting around the expensive dining room before landing on Gabriel. He looked Gabriel up and down, doing that instantaneous male calculus where he tried to figure out if he was the alpha in the room. Gabriel didn't look back. He was casually rotating his whiskey glass on the table. "Who's your friend?" "This is Gabriel," I said tightly. "We're having dinner, if you don't mind." "Oh, a date." Derek chuckled a wet, condescending sound. "Good for you, Nora. Really putting yourself back out there." "I was telling Madison here," he nudged the blonde, "that you were always a bit of a homebody. Hard to get you out of sweatpants." It was a blatant lie designed to make me look pathetic in front of a new man. My fingernails dug into my palms. I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw my drink in his face. But I just sat there, trapped by the social contract of polite society. Gabriel finally stopped rotating his glass. "Sweatpants are comfortable," Gabriel said. He didn't look at Derek when he said it. He didn't raise his voice. He just spoke into the space between them, his tone completely conversational. Derek blinked, thrown off by the absolute lack of defensive energy. He puffed his chest out slightly. "Sure, pal. I'm just saying it's nice to see her making an effort. Though frankly, getting a reservation here usually takes months. I had my assistant book my table back in April." He leaned in, resting one hand on the back of my empty chair. He was invading our space, trying to dominate the physical area. "How'd a guy like you manage to walk in cancellation?" "Something like that," Gabriel murmured. He picked up his fork, inspecting the tines. "Right." Derek sneered. He turned his attention back to me, deciding Gabriel wasn't a threat, just a boring middle management nobody. "Look, Nora, I'm glad I ran into you. I need you to send me the login for the streaming services. You changed the passwords." I stared at him, genuinely incredulous. "You cheat on me, I move out, and 6 months later, you're interrupting my dinner to ask for my Netflix password." Madison shifted uncomfortably, her eyes widening a fraction. Derek's face flushed. The mask of the suave, successful ex cracked, revealing the petty, arrogant child underneath. "Keep your voice down," Derek hissed, glancing around the restaurant. "Don't cause a scene. I pay half that subscription. I'm entitled to it. Just text it to me. And by the way, you still owe me for the security deposit on the apartment." "You kept the apartment, Derek. Yeah, and you left scuff marks on the wall when you dragged your cheap furniture out. He snapped back, his voice rising. A few heads at nearby tables turned. Derek hated looking bad in public, but his temper always overpowered his vanity. He slammed his hand down on our table, rattling the silverware. You always do this. You always act like the victim. I'm trying to be civil, but you're sitting here with some nobody eating food you can't afford, trying to pretend you didn't downgrade. My throat closed up. The humiliation was a hot, prickling sensation washing over my skin. He was doing it again. Making me feel small, making me feel like I was crazy. A heavy silence fell over our table. Gabriel placed his fork down. The soft clink sounded unnaturally loud. He finally looked up at Derek. It wasn't an angry look. There was no furrowed brow, no flared nostrils. It was the cold, vacant stare of someone looking at an insect on a countertop just before bringing down a rolled-up newspaper. The air around Gabriel seemed to warp, pulling the oxygen out of the space. "Take your hand off the table," Gabriel said. Derek scoffed, but I noticed his eyes dart down to Gabriel's hands. "Excuse me, who do you think you're talking to? I know the owner of this restaurant." "Do you?" Gabriel said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah, I do. Paul and I play golf." Derek puffed up, smelling a chance to leverage his fabricated status. He looked around and raised his hand, snapping his fingers loudly. "Hey, Paul, get over here." From across the dining room, the general manager, an impeccably dressed man in his 50s, froze. He saw Derek waving. Then his eyes drifted down to the table. He saw Gabriel. I watched the blood literally drain from the manager's face. Paul didn't walk over. He practically sprinted. He bypassed Derek, completely stopping 2 feet from Gabriel and bowing his head slightly, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. He was sweating. "Mr. Russo," Paul said, his voice trembling. "I apologize. I didn't realize you were in the dining room tonight. My staff didn't inform me." "It's fine, Paul. I didn't want to fuss," Gabriel said softly. Derek frowned, his hand dropping from the air. "Paul, what are you doing? Tell this guy who I am. Tell him I'm a VIP here." Paul slowly turned his head to look at Derek. The manager looked at my ex-boyfriend with a mixture of profound pity and absolute terror. "Sir, I need you to step away from this table. Now." "What? No, I'm Derek. We played at the club last—" "Sir." Paul interrupted, his voice dropping to a desperate whisper. "Please walk away." Derek wasn't stupid. Arrogant, yes, but not entirely devoid of survival instincts. He looked at Paul's terrified posture. Then he looked down at Gabriel. Gabriel was just watching him. Calm. Unblinking. "Who are you?" Derek asked, his voice losing all its bluster. The condescension was gone, replaced by a sudden, sickening realization that he had stepped onto a landmine. Gabriel didn't answer him. He looked at Paul. "Paul," Gabriel said softly. "This man is bothering my guest. He's ruining her appetite." "Immediately, Mr. Russo," Paul said. He snapped his fingers, and 2 massive men in dark suits, who I suddenly realized had been standing by the kitchen doors the entire time, moved forward with terrifying speed. They didn't grab Derek. They just flanked him. "Sir, your reservation is cancelled," Paul said sharply. "You will leave the premises. Now." Derek's jaw worked silently. He looked at the 2 large men, then at Madison, who had already taken 3 large steps backward toward the exit. He looked at me, a flash of genuine fear in his eyes. "Nora," he started, his voice a pathetic squeak. Gabriel leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The subtle movement made both of the men in suits tense up. "You're leaving," Gabriel told Derek. The quiet certainty in his voice left absolutely no room for debate. And if you ever speak to her again, if you ever text her, or call her, or stand within 50 feet of her, I won't have my people ask you to leave. I'll handle it myself. Do you understand?" Derek swallowed hard. His face was the color of old ash. He nodded once, a jerky mechanical movement, and practically scrambled backward. He didn't wait for Madison. He turned and power-walked out of the restaurant, the two men in suits shadowing him out the door. Silence descended on the table again. Paul offered one more terrified apology to Gabriel and scurried away. I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I looked across the table at the man Jess said worked in waste management. Gabriel picked up his scotch, took a sip and looked at me. The coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a mild, apologetic warmth. "Sorry about that," he said. "So, you were saying about your landlord?" I stared at him. My brain felt like a car engine trying to turn over in the dead of winter. It just wouldn't catch. The waiter materialized out of thin air, looking pale and deeply focused. He set 2 plates between us with surgical precision. Seared scallops for me, a ribeye for Gabriel. The smell of browned butter and rosemary hit my nose, but my appetite had officially left the building. The waiter vanished without asking if we needed cracked pepper. Gabriel picked up his knife. He sliced a piece of steak, his movements completely economical. He chewed, swallowed, and took another sip of his scotch. He looked up, catching my wide, unblinking stare. "The scallops here are actually worth the ridiculous price," he said. "Who are you?" The words tumbled out of my mouth before my filter could catch them. He didn't pause. He didn't do the mysterious sigh or the dramatic gaze into the distance. "I told you. I'm Gabriel. You told me you work in waste management. You told Jess you work in logistics." I gripped the edge of the table. "The manager of a Michelin star restaurant just looked at you like you were holding a detonator, Gabriel. Normal people in logistics don't have 2 guys in matching suits materialize out of the kitchen to throw out their ex-boyfriends." "Technically," Gabriel said, setting his knife down, "they work in loss prevention." Loss prevention. Restaurant security. Right. I let out a breath that was half laugh, half panic. "And I suppose the fact that the manager called you Mr. Russo and looked ready to faint is just a coincidence. You just tip really well." Gabriel leaned back in his chair. The harsh lighting from the chandelier above caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones. The exhaustion I had noticed earlier was still there, but now I understood it differently. It wasn't the fatigue of sitting in front of a spreadsheet. It was the weight of constant vigilant control. "Nora," he said softly, "I didn't lie to you. I manage waste. I manage logistics. The only difference between my business and a Fortune 500 company is that my board of directors doesn't use lawyers to settle disputes. We use leverage." The word hung in the air. Leverage. I should have stood up. I should have thrown a 20 on the table for the martini, grabbed my coat and called an Uber. Every self-preservation instinct I had cultivated over 28 years of living in a harsh city was screaming at me to run. You don't date men who carry that kind of gravity. You don't invite them into your life because they don't leave. They consume. But I looked at the empty space where Derek had been standing. For 2 years, Derek had made me feel small. He had gaslit me, cheated on me, and made me believe I was fundamentally difficult to love. In 3 minutes, without raising his voice, Gabriel had dismantled him. I picked up my fork. I took a bite of a scallop. It tasted like ash in my dry mouth, but I chewed it anyway. "So," I said, my voice shaking only a fraction. "Leverage. Is that what you were doing with Derek?" "Derek is a mosquito," Gabriel said simply. "He isn't worth leverage. He just needed to be reminded that his perceived power is entirely situational. We ate the rest of the meal in a surprisingly comfortable silence. The initial shock was wearing off, replaced by a strange, numb curiosity. Gabriel didn't offer any more unprompted confessions, and I didn't push. He asked me about my design work again, and this time I told him about the typography project I was actually passionate about, not just the corporate gigs I complained about. He listened, really listened. His eyes never drifted to his phone, never scanned the room. When he focused on you, it felt like being the only object in a very large, empty room. When the bill came, he didn't even look at the total. He just dropped a black card onto the leather folio. Outside, the autumn air was biting. The valet jogged up, bypassing a row of sleek Porsches and Mercedes, and brought around a massive matte black SUV. It looked heavy. Not just large, but dense, like it was lined with lead. The windows were tinted so darkly they looked like solid obsidian. One of the men in suits from the restaurant, the loss prevention guys, stepped out of the driver's seat. He opened the back door, his face a blank mask. "I can call a car," I said, pulling my coat tighter around my shoulders. "I'll take you home, Nora. It's late." Gabriel gestured to the open door. It wasn't a demand, but it felt inevitable. I climbed in. The interior smelled like expensive leather and faint cedar. Gabriel slid in next to me. The heavy door clicked shut with the sound of a bank vault ceiling. The city noise outside instantly vanished, cut off by inches of acoustic glass. I gave the driver my address. We pulled out into traffic. "Jess didn't know," I said quietly, watching the streetlights bleed across the tinted glass. "She set this up. She wouldn't have set me up with someone in your line of work." "She didn't know," Gabriel confirmed. "She knows my sister. My sister thought I needed to get out of the house. She gave Jess a very sanitized version of my resume." "Will I see you again?" I didn't know why I asked it. It was stupid. It was dangerous. Gabriel turned his head. In the dim light of the back seat, his eyes were unreadable. "Do you want to?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "You terrify me a little bit." A faint, genuine smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Good. You have good instincts, Nora. Most people ignore them." The SUV pulled up to my dingy brick apartment building. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting long shadows over the overflowing dumpsters I had complained to my landlord about for months. The driver got out and opened my door. "Good night, Gabriel," I said, stepping out onto the cracked pavement. "Good night, Nora." He didn't lean in for a kiss. He didn't ask for a second date. He just watched me walk up the steps, and the SUV didn't move an inch until I was safely locked inside the building. I woke up to my phone vibrating aggressively against my nightstand. The clock read 7:15 a.m. I groaned, burying my face in the pillow. My head pounded. The martini from last night was demanding reparations. I fumbled for the phone and swiped to answer without looking at the screen. "Hello." "Nora, tell me you're alive." Jess's voice was a frantic, high-pitched screech that felt like ice picks in my eardrums. "I'm alive, Jess. Why are you yelling?" "I just got off the phone with Sophia." Jess practically hyperventilated. "Sophia, Gabriel's sister, the one from my Pilates class who set you guys up." I rolled onto my back, staring at the water stain on my ceiling. "Yeah, I remember. Nora, she didn't tell me who her family was. She just said her brother ran a logistics company and needed to meet a nice, normal girl. I Googled him this morning because I wanted to see if you guys went anywhere nice. Nora. Nora." "I know, Jess." Dead silence on the other end of the line. "You know," Jess whispered. "You know he's Gabriel Russo, as in the Russo Syndicate, as in the family that the FBI has been trying to indict for racketeering, and extortion for the last 10 years. I didn't know his last name until the restaurant manager practically kissed his ring. I admitted, sitting up and rubbing my temples. But yes, I figured out he wasn't just a mid-level manager. Are you okay? Did he do anything? Oh my God, I set you up with a mob boss. I'm going to federal prison. I'm an accessory to a blind date. Jess calmed down. He was incredibly polite. He paid for dinner, he listened to me vent, and he dropped me off. He didn't try anything. I paused, remembering the cold, terrifying vacuum he had created when Derek showed up. Actually, Derek crashed the date. Derek, that slimy bastard, showed up. What happened? Gabriel had him thrown out. It was efficient. Jess let out a long, shaky breath. Okay. Well, you're alive. You're unhurt. Block his number. Change your locks. We will never speak of this again. I'm so sorry, Nora. I'm so sorry. We hung up. I dragged myself out of bed and made a pot of terrible coffee. The morning light filtering through my cheap blinds made the events of last night feel like a bizarre, gin-soaked fever dream. A mob boss. I had eaten scallops with a man who could probably make people disappear. I shook my head, trying to clear the lingering fog. I needed a shower. I needed to go to work and look at typography until my eyes bled. I needed normalcy. I grabbed my towel and walked into the hallway. And stopped. My front door was open. Not wide open, but cracked about 2 inches. My heart instantly seized in my chest. I had locked it. I vividly remembered turning the deadbolt after I walked inside last night. The lock was notoriously sticky. You had to pull the handle toward you while turning the key. I never forgot to do it. I dropped the towel. I looked around for a weapon settling on a heavy ceramic vase Jess had given me for my birthday last year. I crept toward the door, my bare feet silent on the cheap laminate flooring. Through the crack, I heard a heavy, rhythmic, thudding sound coming from the hallway. Someone was out there. I gripped the vase tighter, my knuckles turning white. I kicked the door open and raised the vase, ready to smash it over the head of whoever was breaking in. I froze. It wasn't a hitman. It wasn't Derek coming back for revenge. It was my landlord, Mr. Henderson. He was a notoriously lazy, miserable man who wore stained undershirts and ignored maintenance requests for months. But right now, he was wearing a button-down shirt, tucked into slacks, sweating profusely and aggressively, using a power drill on the frame of my front door. He jumped when I kicked the door open, dropping the drill. Miss Nora. He gasped, his eyes wide and terrified. Jesus, you scared me. Mr. Henderson, what are you doing to my door? I lowered the vase slightly, though my heart was still hammering against my ribs. I'm replacing the lock, he stammered, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. And the frame. It's solid steel, reinforced now, just putting the finishing touches on. I stared at him. I asked you to fix that lock 4 months ago. I know. I've been neglectful. Terribly neglectful. He looked over his shoulder, down the empty hallway, as if expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. And the fridge? The new one is coming at noon. Stainless steel. And the plumber is coming at 2 to look at the water pressure in your shower. I lowered the vase completely. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The cold, mechanical efficiency of it all. Mr. Henderson, I said slowly. Did someone ask you to do this? He swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed in his throat. A very polite young man called me this morning. At 5 a.m., he explained that a tenant of mine was experiencing subpar living conditions. He suggested it would be in my best interest for my health and the health of my properties to rectify the situation immediately. Mr. Henderson looked at me, his eyes pleading. "The lock is top of the line, Miss Nora. Nobody is getting through this door. Please, if anyone asks, tell them I took care of you." He picked up his drill, hastily finished the last 2 screws on the reinforced strike plate, handed me 2 brand-new keys, and practically sprinted down the hallway toward the stairs. I stood in the doorway holding the shiny brass keys. The heavy steel of the new lock gleamed in the dim hallway light. Gabriel hadn't asked for a second date. He hadn't sent flowers. He had fundamentally altered the reality of my daily life before I even woke up. He had reached into the mundane, frustrating corners of my existence and forcibly fixed them. It was a terrifying display of power. It was also, God help me, the most romantic thing anyone had ever done for me. My phone buzzed in the pocket of my pajama pants. I pulled it out. Unknown number. I swiped answer. Did the lock work? Gabriel's voice was low, carrying that same quiet gravity from the restaurant. I leaned my head against the new solid steel door frame. "You can't go around threatening my landlord." I didn't threaten him. I offered constructive feedback on his property management style. I could hear the faint sound of traffic in the background. He was already out in the world, running his invisible empire. He was very receptive. Gabriel. Nora. I closed my eyes. "Thank you. I don't like people having access to things they shouldn't," he said quietly. "Have a good day at work. I'll pick you up at 7. He hung up before I could say yes. Or no. I spent the entirety of my Tuesday staring at a monitor trying to make a corporate logo look more aggressive, but also welcoming. It was the kind of contradictory, meaningless feedback that usually ruined my week. Today, it barely registered. I nodded during the Zoom calls. I dragged vector points across the screen. I drank 3 cups of break room coffee that tasted like burnt copper. But my mind was tethered to the heavy steel deadbolt on my front door. Every time my phone buzzed with an email notification, my pulse spiked. I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. You don't get involved with a man like Gabriel Russo, even peripherally, and walk away clean. Pop culture had taught me that much. But the day ticked by with agonizing normalcy. Nobody kicked in my office door. Nobody left a severed horse head in my cubicle. It was just me, Adobe Illustrator, and the crippling realization that I had agreed to a second date with a syndicate boss. At 6:55 p.m., I walked out of my office building. The evening air was thick with humidity and the smell of exhaust. The black SUV was idling at the curb. I didn't hesitate. That was the most terrifying part. The cynical, rational voice in my head, the one that had successfully navigated me through bad breakups, terrible apartments, and a soul-crushing career, was entirely silent. I pulled open the heavy rear door and climbed inside. Gabriel was wearing a dark crewneck sweater and slacks. The absence of the tailored suit didn't make him look any softer. If anything, it emphasized the broad, dense line of his shoulders. He was looking at a tablet, his thumb scrolling rhythmically. He turned off the screen the second the door clicked shut. "Rough day?" he asked. "My client wants a font that expresses synergy," I said, leaning back into the leather seat. I spent 4 hours looking at sans serif typefaces until they all looked like ancient hieroglyphs. "How was your day?" "Productive," he said. He didn't elaborate. I appreciated the lack of detail. I didn't want to know what a productive Tuesday looked like for the Russo family. The SUV merged into the heavy downtown traffic. I watched the city lights slide across the tinted glass. "Where are we going? Please tell me it's not another restaurant where the staff looks at you like you're going to order an execution for the main course." Gabriel let out a low, quiet breath that might have been a laugh. No. No Michelin stars tonight. You didn't eat your dinner yesterday. My ex-boyfriend kind of killed my appetite. I noticed. We drove out of the commercial district, heading toward the older industrial edge of the city. The glass skyscrapers gave way to brick warehouses and chain-link fences. The streetlights here were sparser, casting long, bruised shadows across the pavement. The SUV finally pulled up to a faded, aluminum-sided diner. The neon sign in the window was half burnt out, buzzing with a persistent electrical hum. It looked closed. The driver got out and opened my door. I stepped onto the cracked asphalt. The air smelled like fried onions and impending rain. Gabriel walked past me and pushed open the diner's glass door. The bell above it chimed a hollow, cheerful sound, completely at odds with the neighborhood. I followed him inside. The place was empty, save for an older man behind the counter, aggressively scrubbing the grill with a wire brush. He wore a stained white apron and had forearms the size of canned hams. He looked up, his scowl deepening, ready to yell that the kitchen was closed. Then he saw Gabriel. The reaction wasn't the pure, unadulterated terror of Paul, the restaurant manager. It was something deeper. Respect mixed with a heavy dose of resignation. The man set the wire brush down and wiped his hands on a rag. "Gabriel," the man said. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. "Evening, Sal. Kitchen still hot. For you always. The usual. 2. Gabriel said, guiding me to a vinyl booth in the back corner. The red upholstery was patched with silver duct tape. The Formica table was sticky. It was aggressively, unapologetically real. I sat down, sliding into the booth. Gabriel sat across from me. He didn't look out of place here. In the sterile high-end restaurant, he had looked like a predator tolerating a cage. Here, under the flickering fluorescent lights, he looked native to the environment. "So," I said, tracing a coffee ring on the table, "this is where the head of the Russo family takes a date." Gabriel rested his forearms on the table. He didn't flinch at the title. "This is where I take someone when I want to actually talk to them. Fancy restaurants are built for performances. I have to perform enough during the day." Sal walked over, dropping 2 thick, heavy ceramic mugs of black coffee on the table. He didn't ask if we wanted cream or sugar. A few minutes later, he returned with 2 massive plates of steak and eggs, the yolks bright yellow against the heavily peppered meat. I picked up my fork. I was ravenous. I took a bite of the steak. It was incredible. Salty charred, perfect. "You're not asking the questions," Gabriel observed, taking a sip of his coffee. His dark eyes watched me over the rim of the mug. "What questions?" "The ones people usually ask when they figure out who I am. Am I going to get them killed? Have I ever shot anyone? Do I keep money in the walls? Do you... No. Drywall is a terrible insulator for cash. It molds." I swallowed my food and met his gaze. "I'm not asking because I don't want to know the answers, Gabriel. I'm a pragmatist. My ex-boyfriend was a junior partner at a law firm who cried when he got a parking ticket, and he managed to destroy my self-esteem for 2 years. You fixed my front door and fed me steak. I'm currently ignoring the macro ethics of your profession in favor of the micro benefits to my life." Gabriel stopped chewing. He stared at me for a long, heavy moment. The silence stretched thick and absolute. Then, very slowly, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. It changed his entire structure. The exhaustion melted, revealing something intensely sharp and entirely focused on me. "You are a very pragmatic woman, Nora." "I try to be." "Good, because you're going to need to be." We ate in companionable silence. The diner was a pocket of isolation from the rest of the world. The rain had started outside, a steady rhythmic drumming against the dirty glass windows. It felt safe. It felt insulated. It was an illusion, of course. I was just finishing my coffee when the bell above the door jingled sharply. The shift in Gabriel was instantaneous. It wasn't a physical movement, but a complete atmospheric change. The relaxed, open man sitting across from me vanished. The temperature in the booth plummeted. His eyes snapped toward the entrance, calculating, categorizing, and assessing the threat level in a fraction of a second. I turned my head. A man stood dripping in the doorway. He was young, maybe early 20s, wearing a soaked windbreaker. He looked frantic. He scanned the empty diner, saw Gabriel in the back booth, and visibly swallowed. Sal stepped out from the kitchen, a heavy wooden rolling pin gripped loosely in his right hand. He looked at the kid, then looked at Gabriel. Gabriel gave Sal a microscopic nod. Sal retreated back into the kitchen, though he didn't close the swinging door all the way. The kid walked toward our booth. His sneakers squeaked on the wet linoleum. He stopped 3 feet from the table, shivering. "Mr. Russo," the kid stammered. His eyes darted to me, then back to Gabriel. "I'm sorry. They said I could find you here." Gabriel didn't offer a greeting. He didn't tell the kid to sit down. He just stared at him. The silence was a physical weight, pressing down on the kid's shoulders. "It's the docks." The kid blurted out the words, tumbling over each other. "The shipment from the South End. Carter." Carter opened the container early. He didn't wait for the inspector. The local PD rolled by and saw the crates. They didn't seize it, but they're sitting on it. They're waiting for a warrant. Gabriel closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them, they were terrifyingly blank. "Where is Carter?" Gabriel asked. His voice was a whisper. It was the same tone he had used on Derek. "He's in the warehouse. He locked himself in the office. He's panicking, Mr. Russo. He wants to burn the crates before the warrant comes through. If he burns the crates, he burns the warehouse. If he burns the warehouse, he burns my infrastructure." Gabriel picked up a napkin, carefully wiping a drop of coffee off the Formica table. The methodical, slow movement was at total odds with the panic radiating from the kid. "Tell me you didn't leave him alone with a lighter." "Tommy is outside the office door," the kid said quickly. "But Carter is unhinged. You know how he gets when he uses." "I know," Gabriel said. He placed the napkin down. He finally looked at me. "Nora, I apologize. We have to cut this short." "It's fine," I said. My voice sounded remarkably steady, though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Gabriel stood up. He pulled a $100 bill from his pocket and dropped it on the table. He looked at the kid. "Go to the car. Tell the driver we're going to the South End. Now." The kid nodded rapidly and practically sprinted out of the diner. Gabriel turned back to me. "I'm having a car sent for you. It will be here in 5 minutes. The driver will take you straight home. He won't leave your building until you are inside and the deadbolt is thrown." "You don't have to manage my logistics," I said, trying for a weak smile. "I can take an Uber." "No Ubers," Gabriel said sharply. The command snapped through the air. He caught himself taking a slow breath, dialing back the terrifying authority. "No Ubers, Nora." "Not tonight." I stood up, sliding out of the booth. I was suddenly very aware of how large he was, how completely he blocked the aisle. "Gabriel, what are you going to do to him?" "To Carter." It was the question I had promised myself I wouldn't ask. The micro-benefits were gone. The macro-ethics were standing right in front of me, smelling of rain and impending violence. Gabriel looked down at me. He didn't soften his expression. He didn't lie to protect my delicate sensibilities. Carter made a mistake. Gabriel said, his voice flat. "Mistakes in my business cost people their freedom, or their lives. He compromised my people because he couldn't control his habit. I am going to remove him from the equation." Remove him, I repeated. The words felt like ash. I run a violent machine, Nora. I told you I manage waste. Tonight, Carter is the waste. He stepped closer. The heat radiating off him was intense. This is the reality. This is what pays for the Michelin-starred dinners and the reinforced locks. I don't scream. I don't throw tantrums like your ex. But I am ruthless because my survival requires it. He reached out his knuckles lightly, brushing against my jaw. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark contrast to the horrific thing he had just admitted. This is the boundary, Gabriel said softly. This is where normal girls turn around and run away. The car will be here in 3 minutes. If you get in it and you lock your door tonight, I will delete your number. You will never see me again. You can go back to your fonts and your terrible clients, and I will be a story you tell Jess after a few glasses of wine. I stared up into his dark, exhausted eyes. The logical part of my brain was screaming at me to run. Run to the car. Change cities. Disappear. He was offering me a clean break. And if I don't want you to delete my number? I asked. Gabriel's jaw clenched. The muscle feathered under his skin. Then you are stepping over the line, and I don't let people step back once they cross it. Headlights swept across the front of the diner, illuminating the rain-slicked glass. A second black SUV had pulled up to the curb. My ride home. Gabriel dropped his hand from my face. He turned and walked out of the diner, heading toward his own waiting vehicle. He didn't look back. I stood in the empty diner listening to the rain, the hissing grill, and the sound of 2 distinct paths diverging in front of me. I looked at the heavy mug of coffee on the table. I looked at the door. I pulled my coat tight against my chest, walked out into the downpour, and pulled open the door of the waiting car. The ride back to my apartment was entirely silent. The driver, a broad-shouldered man, whose neck strained against his shirt collar, didn't turn on the radio. He didn't ask how my night was. He drove with a smooth, aggressive efficiency, cutting through the rain-slicked streets like a shark moving through dark water. I sat in the back, watching the blurry neon lights of the city smear across the tinted glass. Gabriel had given me a perfectly clean exit. It was wrapped in a threat, the deletion of a number, the absolute severing of ties, but it was an exit nonetheless. My life could go back to what it was at 8 a.m. on Friday morning. I could go back to dodging Derek's petty texts, fighting with my landlord over water pressure, and going on blind dates with men who talked about their crypto portfolios for 2 hours. It would be safe. It would be entirely suffocatingly normal. The SUV pulled up to my building. The driver killed the engine, stepped out into the downpour, and opened my door. He walked me up the concrete steps, standing rigidly on the landing, while I fumbled for my new keys. I slid the heavy brass key into the steel lock. It turned with a satisfying heavy clack. I pushed the door open, stepped inside, and looked back at the driver. He was waiting. "Good night," I said. He gave a sharp nod. "Lock it, miss." I closed the door. I threw the deadbolt. I leaned my forehead against the cool steel. The apartment was completely quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was my sanctuary. It was my cage. I walked into the living room, didn't bother turning on the lights, and sat down on my cheap, uncomfortable sofa. I pulled my phone out of my coat pocket. The screen cast a harsh blue glow across the dark room. I opened my contacts. I stared at the blank entry where I had saved his number. No name. Just a string of digits. "If you get in it and you lock your door tonight, I will delete your number." My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I was 28 years old. I had spent my entire adult life playing it safe, shrinking myself down to fit into the cramped, acceptable spaces left behind by arrogant men. I had played by the rules of civil society, and my reward had been a profound, lingering misery. Gabriel Russo didn't play by the rules. He made them. I typed a message. I didn't overthink it. I didn't draft it in the Notes app first. The door is locked. But I'm not running. Don't delete the number. I hit send. I didn't expect a reply. I threw the phone onto the cushion next to me, pulled a blanket over my knees, and fell asleep right there in my work clothes, listening to the rain beat against the window pane. The next day was a masterclass in disassociation. I went to the office. I presented 3 variations of a logo to a startup founder who used the word disrupt 6 times in a 10-minute call. I ate a sad turkey sandwich at my desk. I also scoured the local news sites. I looked for fires. I looked for police raids on the South End docks. I looked for obituaries mentioning a man named Carter. There was nothing. Not a whisper. It was as if the crisis in the diner had never happened. The realization settled heavy in my stomach. Gabriel's world operated entirely beneath the surface of mine. When things broke, they were fixed quietly. When people became waste, they simply ceased to exist in the public record. I got home at 6 p.m. The lock worked perfectly. The apartment was exactly as I had left it. At 9 p.m., a knock sounded at my door. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was 3 solid, deliberate strikes against the steel. I walked over my pulse, suddenly vibrating in my throat, and looked through the peephole. Gabriel stood in the hallway. I undid the deadbolt and pulled the door open. He was wearing the same dark sweater from the diner, but the immaculate composure was fractured. He looked like he had spent the last 24 hours dismantling a bomb with his bare hands. There was a faint smudge of grease or soot on his jaw. His eyes were shadowed bloodshot at the corners. He smelled heavily of black coffee rain and cold concrete. He didn't step inside. He just looked at me, taking in my oversized sweatpants and the messy bun on top of my head. "You sent the text," he said. His voice was raspy, stripped of its usual smooth gravity. "I did. I gave you an out, Nora." "I know." I crossed my arms over my chest, holding my ground in the doorway. "And I declined it. I told you I'm a pragmatist. I weighed the pros and cons. There are no pros," Gabriel said harshly. "My life is a liability. It is violent, it is demanding, and it does not stop. I spent the last 18 hours cleaning up a mess that would have sent 3 of my men to federal prison. The man responsible is no longer a problem. Do you understand what that means? I understand that you do what you have to do to protect your people," I said evenly. I was terrified, yes. But looking at him, exhausted carrying a weight that would crush a normal man, the terror was eclipsed by a fierce, undeniable pull. "Are you going to come inside, or are you going to stand in my hallway, trying to convince me I'm making a mistake?" Gabriel stared at me. The tension in his jaw flexed. Then the invisible wall he kept between himself and the rest of the world shattered. He stepped over the threshold. He kicked the door shut behind him, the heavy steel slamming into the frame, and he closed the distance between us. His hands came up, framing my face, his thumbs tracking along my cheekbones. His palms were rough, calloused. He kissed me. It wasn't gentle. It was a collision. It felt desperate, like a man taking his first breath of oxygen after pulling himself out of a freezing river. I grabbed the front of his sweater, grounding myself against his solid, heavy frame, and kissed him back. The lingering smell of smoke and cold air clung to his clothes. When he finally pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. His chest heaved against my palms. "You're in Nora," he whispered, his voice a low vibration against my skin. You stepped over the line. There is no going back now. I know. I breathed. The adjustment period was abrupt. Dating Gabriel Russo wasn't about public declarations or sweeping romantic gestures. It was a masterclass in reading the negative space. 3 weeks in a bizarre, heavily fortified routine settled over my life. I still went to work. I still fought with tech clients over color palettes that felt too corporate. But the edges of my reality were now walled off by invisible titanium. I noticed the black sedan parked down the street from my office every afternoon. I noticed that when I went for my Sunday run, a broad-shouldered jogger in a grey hoodie maintained a 40-yard distance behind me. Gabriel never mentioned them. I never asked. It was the unspoken tax of our arrangement. Gabriel existed in my life entirely outside of standard business hours. He arrived late, shedding the heavy armor of his day job at the door. He didn't talk about the syndicate. We ordered Thai takeout, watched terrible true crime documentaries, and slept. It was an intensely domestic bubble, completely isolated from his violent machinery, until the machinery bled into the daylight. It happened on a Tuesday. I was standing at an artisan coffee cart, 2 blocks from my office, reviewing Pantone swatches on my phone. Nora. 2 men stood on the sidewalk entirely out of place among the midtown tech crowd. They wore cheap, ill-fitting suits. The older man had a graying mustache and deeply cynical eyes. The younger one was aggressively chewing gum. "Detective Callahan, this is Detective Ruiz," the older man said, invading my personal space to manufacture authority. "We work organized crime. Do you have a minute?" My stomach dropped in an icy plunge of adrenaline. I kept my face blank. "I have a meeting in 10 minutes. It's about Gabriel Russo," Ruiz said, popping a bubble. "We know you two have been spending a lot of time together. Late nights at your place, quiet dinners at Sal's. Knowing about Sal's Gabriel's personal sanctuary made the ice in my chest spread. They had been watching us." Callahan leaned in, smelling of stale tobacco and desperation. "Look, Nora, you're a normal girl. You have a clean record. You don't belong in the deep end. Gabriel Russo is a dangerous man. He smiles, he pays for dinner, but underneath he destroys everything he touches. A federal task force is closing in. When the hammer falls, it crushes everyone standing near him, including the girl he uses to look normal. Tell us what he talks about, who visits your apartment, and you can walk away clean." They wanted me to be an informant. I looked at Callahan's tired eyes. I thought of Derek, my clean, normal ex-boyfriend, who systematically dismantled my self-worth while society applauded his success. Then I thought of Gabriel, who walked through the dark so I could sleep soundly behind a reinforced door. "Gabriel and I talk about graphic design," I said, stepping around Callahan to grab my latte from the barista. "He has strong opinions on sans serif fonts. If you want a statement on typography, call my lawyer. Have a good afternoon, detectives." I walked away without looking back, but my hands shook so violently I spilled hot coffee over my knuckles. I didn't call Gabriel. I finished my workday. But the paranoia had firmly set in. The invisible wall protecting my life had been breached. When Gabriel arrived at my apartment at 11 p.m., I was sitting on the kitchen counter in the dark, drinking a glass of cheap wine. He took one look at my posture and stopped dead in the entryway. The relaxed, exhausted man vanished. The apex predator snapped into focus. His dark eyes scanned the shadows of the room, calculating trajectories, looking for broken glass, searching for a threat. "What happened?" he demanded. The temperature in the room plummeted. "Nothing physical," I said, taking a sip of wine to wet my dry throat. 2 city detectives paid me a visit at the coffee cart today. Callahan and Ruiz. They warned me about federal indictments. They wanted me to report back on you." Gabriel didn't move. He stood absolutely motionless in the hallway, the leather of his jacket creaking slightly as his chest expanded with a slow, intensely controlled breath. "Did they touch you?" The words were barely a whisper, yet they vibrated with a lethal, terrifying violence. "No, just talked." Gabriel closed his eyes. He pinched the bridge of his nose. The sheer magnitude of the rage rolling off his frame was suffocating. When he opened his eyes, they were completely black. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number without looking away from me. "It's me. Pull the file on Callahan Organized Crime Division. Debts leverage everything. By morning." He dropped the phone on the counter and stepped in, caging my knees with his hands. "They will never approach you in daylight again. I'm going to ruin them." I didn't sleep that night. I lay wide awake in the dark, staring at the water stain on my ceiling, hyper-aware of the solid, heavy warmth of Gabriel beside me. He slept the way he executed every other aspect of his life, with absolute stillness and deep, unwavering focus. His chest rose and fell in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. I turned my head, studying the sharp lines of his profile, illuminated by the faint, orange glow of the street lamp outside. I reached out, my fingertips lightly tracing the line of a faded, jagged scar resting just above his collarbone. The skin there was rough, a physical map of a violently guarded life. He had promised to ruin 2 decorated city detectives. He had said it with the casual, terrifying certainty of a man predicting the sunrise. I lay there listening to him breathe, waiting for the guilt to set in. It never came. The execution of that promise took exactly 72 hours. Those 3 days were a bizarre exercise in cognitive dissonance. I went to work. I sat in brightly lit conference rooms and listened to marketing managers debate the emotional resonance of different shades of cyan. I drank lukewarm tap water. I nodded at appropriate intervals. But beneath the mundane surface of my day job, a countdown was ticking. I was waiting for the explosion. I expected SWAT teams or a shootout on the evening news, or Callahan kicking down my cheap steel door. But Gabriel didn't build his empire on loud, messy explosions. His violence was structural. He didn't need to break a man's legs when he could quietly break the foundation of a man's entire life. On Friday morning, the office was quiet. I was at my desk, aggressively ignoring a client's email demanding more pop in a grayscale brochure when my phone buzzed against the cheap laminate wood. It was a text from Jess. Just a link to a local news site. No context. I clicked it. The page loaded, displaying a small headline buried in the metro section. "Veteran organized crime detective suspended amid internal affairs probe." I read the 4 short paragraphs. Detective Callahan had been placed on administrative leave following an anonymous, highly detailed tip that exposed severe, undisclosed financial entanglements. The article outlined a string of massive gambling debts. It detailed a second mortgage tied to an offshore shell company in the Caymans. It was the kind of deeply buried, heavily sanitized dirt that ended careers, revoked pensions, and resulted in quiet, desperate pleas for early retirement. The final sentence was a brief footnote mentioning his partner, Detective Ruiz. He hadn't been fired. He had been abruptly reassigned to a property evidence warehouse in the furthest, most desolate county in the state, effective immediately. They hadn't been killed. They had been erased, stripped of their badges, their authority, and their ability to ever approach me on a sunny Tuesday afternoon again. I set the phone face down on my desk. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. I looked at my hands. They weren't shaking. My stomach wasn't turning. I didn't feel sick or compromised. I felt an overwhelming, profound sense of safety. It was a dark, twisted kind of safety, built on extortion and ruined livelihoods, but it was incredibly real. For 2 years, I had let Derek convince me I was crazy helpless and easily replaced. Society had protected Derek because he wore a nice suit and worked at a law firm. Gabriel didn't care about society's protections. He had dismantled my ex-boyfriend in 3 minutes, and he had systematically dismantled a federal investigation simply because 2 men made me feel uncomfortable on my coffee break. That night, when I climbed into the back of the idling black SUV, the driver didn't take the familiar route toward my dingy neighborhood. He navigated through the dense city center, pulling down a concrete ramp into the subterranean garage of a massive glass-fronted high-rise. Gabriel was waiting for me at the private elevator. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, exposing the thick corded veins in his forearms. He didn't say a word as I stepped in beside him. The steel doors slid shut, sealing us in. He just reached out, wrapping an arm around my waist, pulling me flush against his side. His hand rested heavy and warm on my hip. The penthouse occupied the entire top floor. It was vast, silent, and strictly minimal. There was no clutter, no unnecessary noise. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a sprawling, unbroken view of the city grid. From up here, the streets looked like golden arteries pulsing in the dark. The people below were entirely invisible. Gabriel walked over to a dark wood console. He poured 2 glasses of scotch. He handed me one, his knuckles briefly brushing against mine. The heavy crystal felt cold against my palm. "I saw the news," I said, quietly. I looked out over the skyline, watching the headlights move in slow, distant rivers. Gabriel took a sip of his drink. He didn't look at the view. He looked at me. "I told you they wouldn't approach you again. Callahan was a hypocrite with a severe gambling addiction. I simply provided the documentation to internal affairs. They handled the rest." "You ruined him." "I removed an obstacle," he corrected softly. He stepped closer. The absolute quiet of the penthouse amplified the low, dark register of his voice. "This is it, Nora. The final line. I can have the driver take you home right now. You can go back to your fonts and your life, and I will be a ghost." It was a test. He needed to know if I could stomach the reality of the man standing in front of me. He wasn't a misunderstood anti-hero. He was the apex predator of this city. I stepped closer to him. The scent of cedar and expensive scotch enveloped me. I looked up into the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. He was a monster, yes, but he was my monster. He stood between me and a world that had always tried to make me smaller, and with him I was entirely untouchable. "No," I said, my voice dead steady. "I'm not going anywhere." Gabriel's eyes darkened, the pupils expanding. The rigid, flawless control he always maintained finally snapped. He took the glass out of my hand, setting it blindly onto the sill, and pulled me hard against his chest. His mouth crashed down on mine, hungry, possessive, and absolute, claiming the final willing surrender of my old life. The city lights burned far below us, millions of people living their normal, safe lives. I didn't envy them anymore. I had found my place in the dark. If you loved seeing Nora finally embrace the dark side, and Gabriel prove exactly why you don't mess with what's his smash, that like button. This story proves that the best revenge against a toxic ex isn't just moving on, it's leveling up in ways they can't even comprehend. Gabriel is the ultimate quiet protector, and their dynamic is absolute fire. Do you think Nora made the right choice by choosing loyalty to a syndicate boss over a normal life? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to share this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss another intense, dark romance story.